Samkele, I believe we're ever closer to the arrival of that plane carrying the remains of the former president.
Well, Marcel, at this point in time, the remains of the former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, have not yet arrived here at the international airport in Harare, named after him. But the number one citizen, the incumbent number one citizen of this country, formerly known as Rhodesia, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has arrived here at the international airport to receive the remains of the former president. He arrived about 5 minutes or so ago. You'd remember, Marcel, that Emmerson Mnangagwa had turned to a political foe of the former president, who later passed on last week Friday in a Singaporean hospital. We do know that his remains left Singapore this morning at about 9:30 to 10 o'clock South African time. Those remains will be arriving shortly here at the international airport in Harare, named after him. They left the Seychelles about 2.5 hours ago, hence the arrival of Emmerson Mnangagwa now at about 5 to 3, about 5 minutes ago here at this international airport. After the remains arrive here, they will be making their way to Zazimba, where Robert Mugabe is from and spent most of his time.
Now, the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, was the one who confirmed the death of the former president on his social media pages. Much has been told over the last few days about the relationship between those two, because Emmerson Mnangagwa was, of course, Robert Mugabe's deputy for many, many years.
Well, Marcel, if you'd remember politically, in the politics of the leading political formation here in Zimbabwe and the incumbent political formation, ZANU-PF, Emmerson Mnangagwa was the deputy secretary in terms of the political structure of ZANU-PF to Robert Mugabe, who was the secretary of ZANU-PF, and the president of the country, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the deputy president. Then we had Grace Mugabe, the wife of the deceased, now the former president, Robert Mugabe, who was tipped to take over the presidency of ZANU-PF from Mugabe. You'd understand that they said that was an internal coup within ZANU-PF, which led to Emmerson Mnangagwa being fired as the deputy president of the country, and he had to flee the country through Botswana and entering into South Africa after they had hatched a coup and a takeover of leadership within the country with the army, with Constantino Chiwenga, who is now the deputy president of Zimbabwe and also the deputy secretary of ZANU-PF. That coup was successful. The army left the barracks and went to the streets of Harare and Zimbabwe, taking over power. First, the army took over the public broadcaster here, or the state broadcaster ZBC, announcing that the president, in the form of the former president Robert Mugabe, was safe in his Blue Roof house. And the rest is history on how Emmerson Mnangagwa took power. Then you had Robert Mugabe, who was bitter over the coup and that he had been taken over power, said that Emmerson Mnangagwa is an illegitimate president and had not been duly elected by Zimbabweans and through the party structures of ZANU-PF. Their relationship had soured to an all-time low, prompting the deceased, now the former president, to endorse his rival political formation, the MDC's alliances, Nelson Chamisa, for the presidency in the elections that took place here in Zimbabwe. So their relationship was rather frosty. We also spoke to Leo Mugabe, who's the spokesperson of the family, who did confirm that Robert Mugabe was very bitter after the coup d'etat here in the country, and Robert Mugabe was warming up to the leadership of Emmerson Mnangagwa when he sent his daughter to Mnangagwa's inauguration. So the relationship was very frosty. There have also been allegations that Robert Mugabe did confide in his wife, Grace Mugabe, that he would like his tormentors and those who betrayed him within ZANU-PF and the politics of the country to play a minimal role as possible in his burial and funeral.
Now, speaking of his burial and funeral, while he was president, Robert Mugabe had a bit of a soft spot for quite a bit of pomp and ceremony. He used national events often just to show how secure he was in power and in the presidency. One would expect quite a bit of that pomp and ceremony and statehood in his state funeral, Samkele. What are we expecting to happen from the time that his remains arrive there in Harare?
As you can see from the live visuals that my colleague Linga Ndabambi is feeding through, you can see that they are preparing for the entry of from the VIP area for the incumbent Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa in that particular white tent, where you can see that there are two chairs which are basically put there for the president of Zimbabwe and for, I assume, the deputy president or the vice president. That would be Kembo Mohadi, who is accompanying the family coming from Singapore, and also a space for the grieving former First Lady, Grace Mugabe. So the family will come through and they will sit in pass through the red carpets that have been laid off for the family and the former president, and they would go to the white tent that has been erected there for the president of Zimbabwe and the grieving family and other government officials. There's also an area which my colleague Lingen Dabambi will show you just in between these two gentlemen, the police officer and the cameraman also working his craft. There is an area there which has been placed for the remains of the former president Robert Mugabe to be placed. It's under army guard. There's an army guard that's been put there to make sure that the remains are guarded, and there's a red carpet that will see the remains coming from the aircraft that will be landing from Singapore, going towards this area where the remains will be made and received by the incumbent president of the country of Zimbabwe. That would be Emmerson Mnangagwa, who's also arrived, and then from there they will be making their way to a local parlor where his remains will be cleaned up, and then I would assume through the plan that we have seen, his remains would then be sent off through to Zimba or through his official residence here in Harare. That would be the Blue Reef residence where he was held hostage during the coup d'etat.
What are we hearing in terms of the dignitaries that are expected to arrive for that state funeral, Samkele? We know that during his time as president, Robert Mugabe first had a wonderful relationship, especially with Western powers, and that then later on soured further into his very long time as president of Zimbabwe. Who are we expected to see in terms of current heads of state and former heads of state?
Various diplomats will be making their way here for the official funeral of Robert Mugabe on Saturday. We do know that a South African delegation will also be coming through that will be led by the incumbent president of the Republic of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's also going to be coming with the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe. They will also be doubling up as a delegation coming from the governing party. That would be the African National Congress, with Cyril Ramaphosa being the president of the ANC and Gwede Mantashe being the national chairperson. We are not yet sure whether former Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda will be making his way here as well, but we do know that he was one of the various politicians within the African continent who served with other former liberation movements in the African continent to come and persuade Robert Mugabe to step down as the president of Zimbabwe after that coup d'etat, or during that coup attempt by the military here in Zimbabwe. We do not know that other heads of state, that such as Uhuru Kenyatta, may be making their way here. It's not yet sure whether the president of Rwanda will also be making the way here, or on any other African presidents. But we do know the meaningful role, or the role that the Pan-Africanist Robert Mugabe has played within the geopolitics of the African continent and globally, looking at his various speeches at United Nations, particularly at the Security Council, speaking speaking on how Africa should have a permanent seat in the Security Council in the United Nations, and how he was an advocate of such a move. You'd also remember his speech which he made about Tony Blair keeping his England or United Kingdom and him keeping his Zimbabwe, particularly after the early 2000s land restoration project here. So various heads of state within the African continent and globally may be making their way here. We also know that there was a very warm relationship between China and Zimbabwe. So you may see people like the Chinese president and the secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, making his way here to the official funeral of Robert Mugabe at the National Sports Stadium on Saturday.
What do we know about the time spent by the family following the departure of Robert Mugabe from the presidency in Zimbabwe? We know he had taken ill and was being taken care of at a state-of-the-art hospital in Singapore. But has he and his family spent much time at all in Zimbabwe since late 2017?
It is alleged that since the coup in late 2017, Robert Mugabe's health deteriorated rapidly as he was not particularly well, and he felt betrayed by his longtime political allies in the form of Constantino Chiwenga within the army. You look at Emmerson Mnangagwa, his deputy secretary within ZANU-PF and deputy president in government. He felt betrayed by his political allies and his health deteriorated to an all-time low. He was on a wheelchair at some point before he had to go and spend about a month or two in a Singaporean hospital until his death, where in that Singaporean hospital alongside, it said that when he passed away, his family was around him, his sons whom have spent some time in South Africa, his wife Grace Mugabe was also there, and other family members. So those are some of the things that have played themselves out. You just also remember the interviews that Robert Mugabe did have going towards the election after he was removed, and there was an election in the country, and the election of Emmerson Mnangagwa. He held a view that they were not good to take this country forward, and he endorsed the candidature of Nelson Chamisa of the MDC alliance. You remember the MDC through the late Morgan Tsvangirai was his political nemesis here in the province. They were his arch rival, and you remember that negotiation period which former president of South Africa Thabo Mbeki negotiated, which led to Morgan Tsvangirai being the prime minister of this country and the likes of Tandai Biti being the finance minister. You'd remember how that government collapsed, and the ANC and the South African government had to once again come and negotiate and facilitate negotiations here in Zimbabwe. So Robert Mugabe was not particularly, one may say, chuffed with the new leadership of ZANU-PF and of the country, and that relationship was frosty, which ultimately led to his health deteriorating to an all-time low, which led to his demise.
Okay, we're going to take a pause there for a moment and leave our live pictures there from Samkele Maseko reporting to us live there from the international airport in Harare, where we are awaiting the arrival of the remains of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe.